The doctor saved a sick vagrant when she came to the dump at the request of a homeless boy. And upon hearing what he whispered in his delirium, almost everyone who had ever stepped foot in the local clinic knew Amy Todd. The general practitioner was dedicated to her work and always helped those in need. It might seem like there was nothing particularly special about that, but Amy was indeed special. In addition to seeing patients during her shifts, she would volunteer her free time to help those who, due to their low social status, were unlikely to seek medical assistance on their own. "Do you really need to bother with these vagrants, Amy? The entire clinic is already looking at you sideways," her husband would say. She would just shrug, replying, "Well, let them look. That's all they know how to do. It's not like I live at the dump. And no one can forbid me from using my personal stethoscope outside the clinic." Jerry frowned. That was just the kind of person Amy was, someone her colleagues secretly laughed at. After all, she had always had her share of envious people. Patients loved Amy, and when they registered at the front desk, they would specifically request to see her. Part of this popularity was due to her video blog, where she offered valuable health advice to the local residents. Everyone watched Amy's videos, young and old alike. Some people even took notes, just in case. The future is unpredictable, and you never know when you might need that information. Today, the day seemed to drag on endlessly. Sitting in her office, Amy kept glancing out the window. It was cloudy, the sky overcast, and it looked like rain could start any minute. "Amy, could I go home early today? I live in the suburbs and need to catch the bus. And the weather's looking rough." "I didn't bring an umbrella today," Nurse Dorothy Walker asked cautiously. Amy tore her gaze away from her paperwork and nodded in agreement. "Of course, go ahead. The day's almost over anyway. It's unlikely anyone else will come in today." A sweet smile immediately spread across the nurse's face. "Thank you, Amy. You're the best doctor I've ever worked with." Amy smiled back and looked at the sky again. At that moment, a bolt of lightning pierced through the gray veil of clouds, and a second later, the windows of her office rattled with a tremendous clap of thunder. Dorothy gasped and hurried towards the door. Amy shook her head ruefully. She considered asking her husband to pick her up from work, but, unfortunately, Jerry had promised to help his mother with some repairs. As usual, Janet Peterson had insisted on starting the project at the most inconvenient time. Amy was supposed to go on vacation in 2 weeks. They had planned to spend a few days by the sea. Amy really needed the break, but what would she do without her street patients, who, if necessary, even came to her house? Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Amy cast an anxious glance at the clock on the wall. 5 minutes until the end of the workday. For many of her colleagues, that was a solid reason to lock the door and head home with a clear conscience. But she always tried to follow the rules. After all, there was a reason they were put in place. "Come in," Amy said, instinctively turning her gaze towards the door. She was surprised to see a boy of about 10 step into her office. "Mark, what are you doing here?" she couldn't help but ask. Amy actually knew this little orphan, who often ran away from the orphanage and wandered around the city in search of something he valued, whether it was candy or freshly baked goods. She had met Mark at the supermarket checkout, where a security guard had caught him holding a bun. Tears had welled up in the boy's eyes because he wasn't a thief. The small change he had carefully collected had simply fallen through a hole in the pocket of his worn-out pants. Mark had stood by the checkout, wiping tears from his dirty cheeks with his hand. Amy hadn't hesitated. She walked up to the guard and handed him money for the bun and even paid the fine. "Look at Miss Goody Two-Shoes. It's kids like this that grow up to be beggars and crooks. No need to spoil them from a young age," someone had remarked. But Amy didn't care. The important thing was that she had helped the boy, and really, this could happen to anyone. Since then, Mark and Amy had become friends. They didn't see each other often, but sometimes she would help the boy by buying sweets for him and his friends at the orphanage. Sometimes she'd send over a small box of pastries or buy some fruit. This didn't mean the kids at the orphanage weren't getting enough to eat. It was more about something else. Sweets and fruit meant more to the kids than regular food, and they were always in short supply. "Hi, Mark. What brings you here? Just visiting, or did something happen?" Amy asked. The boy looked at the kind lady in an odd way before saying, "Yeah, I've got a problem." "Well, not me, but Grandpa Frank. He lives at the dump. Found a man there yesterday, but he's unconscious, delirious, with a high fever. Grandpa thinks it's just a cold, but he doesn't know what medicine to give him. Can you come, Amy?" She hesitated. The boy was essentially asking her to go to the city dump, and in this weather, no less. Not exactly a pleasant task, to say the least. "Mark, isn't there another way? Maybe we could bring him to the clinic? He might need a chest x-ray. Amy, you know Grandpa Frank's health isn't great. He's not really a vagrant. After his son died, his daughter-in-law kicked him out of the apartment. There's no way he can carry the man here by himself. We tried calling an ambulance, but the road's been dug up. And with this rain, there's no way a car can get through. So, you're our only hope," Mark pleaded. Amy looked out the window again. The clouds were thickening, and a trip to the dump threatened to bring trouble. Yet, after hearing the boy's words, a sense of unease took root in her heart. What if she really was the last hope for this poor soul? After all, he clearly hadn't ended up at the dump by choice. Life is unpredictable. "All right, Mark, let's go now. If you say it's a cold, I'll stop by the pharmacy to pick up some medicine." It's not the ideal way to do things, but it seems like we don't have another option, Amy decided. Grabbing her purse, she headed for the door. A satisfied smile appeared on Mark's face. From the look in his eyes, Amy could tell he was impressed by her decision. Amy knew that the boy's parents had died in an accident. They lived in the suburbs, maintaining a small farm with a cow, chickens, and geese. They sold their products at the city market. The income was modest but steady. On that fateful day, there was thick fog. A neighbor had tried to persuade them not to go, insisting she'd had a bad dream, a sign that should not be ignored. But Ruby and Matthew Rivera didn't believe in signs and decided to go anyway. How could they miss market day? Business was booming, and they were planning to renovate their house. Their son had just turned 3, and they still didn't have a proper nursery. The neighbor cried and tried to stop them, but to no avail. They drove into the fog, heading toward their tragic fate, which took the form of a truck that veered into their lane. Mark's father died instantly. His mother lingered in a coma for just over a week before she passed away, following her husband. The neighbor, Betty Bell, tried to keep the boy, but social services refused, citing her age and her failing health, which indeed was becoming an issue. And so, Mark ended up in the orphanage, where he still lived. Among the caregivers, he was known as a capable boy, participating in arts and sports activities. However, the latter was challenging since the sports field behind the orphanage was in terrible condition. But Mark didn't let that discourage him. He trained in the city park, racing against the ever-present squirrels that chased the young athlete from the tree branches. A sudden clap of thunder overhead snapped Amy out of her melancholy thoughts. Mark jumped in surprise and looked at the sky with annoyance. "Don't worry, little friend, it'll pass soon. It'll rumble a bit and then stop." Amy smiled and quickened her pace. On the way, they stopped at the pharmacy, where she bought some medicines that, based on her knowledge and experience, were essential for treating any cold. Deciding to take a shortcut, Amy took the boy's hand and led him to the bus stop. It felt safer that way. They might even avoid the rain while they rode, and at least they'd have a roof over their heads. If necessary, they could get off at any stop and wait out the bad weather. The sky rumbled and flashed, but oddly, there was no rain. It felt as if the air was charged with energy that still hadn't found its release in the form of the downpour that was eagerly waiting to drench the city. Sitting by the window, Mark watched with interest as people scurried back and forth on their errands, some urgent, some not. It was just another ordinary day in the bustling city. After reaching the final stop, Amy and Mark got off the bus and headed towards the dump, easily identified by the characteristic smoke rising in the distance, resembling a ghostly haze. At the same time, Amy caught a whiff of a foul stench carried by the wind. Mark, however, led her confidently, unfazed by the discomfort caused by the sight and smell of the dump. At some point, Amy even suspected that the boy had been here many times, visiting Frank. She had heard about this elderly man, who was passionate about painting and even collected various postcards and discarded photocopies of famous paintings from the dump. Frank Curtis had never gained any recognition in the art world and had reduced his painting to a mere hobby, a free-spirited artist living on the vast expanse of the city dump. Carefully following Mark, Amy cautiously navigated around the spontaneous piles of garbage that popped up in their path. At that moment, her only concern was what had happened to the homeless man whom Frank had taken in. As she pushed through the trash, struggling against the intensifying stench, Mark had already run ahead to the small shack from which a muffled cough could be heard. The little shack was tiny, with only 2 windows, made from old boards and covered with sheets of metal. The roof was patched with pieces of slate instead of tiles. Amy even doubted the sturdiness of the shelter, especially as the sky grew darker by the minute, threatening a heavy downpour. "Frank, we're here," Mark called out, peeking through the half-open door. There was no response. "Frank, where are you?" Mark repeated, tapping on the doorframe. By this time, Amy was already standing beside him, watching. "Frank," Amy tried calling out. Silence was the only reply. Finally, the door creaked open, and a thin elderly man with a pale face appeared on the threshold. He looked at them with sad eyes, reflecting not only pain but also a deep sorrow. "Frank!" Mark cried out, running up to him and wrapping his arm around the man's shoulder. Amy cautiously approached. "Hello, Frank," she said, trying to assess his condition. "Hello," he replied. "Come in." Inside, it was dark, and the air was damp and stale. In the corner stood a small stove with a black pot hanging above it, and Frank's drawings decorated the walls. Most of them were landscapes and portraits of passers-by that he had sketched from life. "And where is the patient?" Amy asked carefully, always mindful of her time. "Over here," Frank replied. "I laid him on the cot yesterday evening, unconscious. He was soaked through, even his underclothes. He was delirious, muttering something incomprehensible. So, I picked him up and dragged him here to my shack. Seems like he got thoroughly drenched somewhere and then fell ill, the poor fellow," Frank explained. Amy approached the man lying on the makeshift bed. He appeared to be around 30, with well-defined facial features, a slight stubble, and an unnatural thinness. Dark circles had formed under his eyes, indicating that he was in very poor health. She took a thermometer from her bag and gently placed it under his arm. But the moment she touched the man's body, Amy could tell he had a high fever. As a doctor, she couldn't prescribe treatment without a full examination. Pressing the stethoscope to the man's chest, she heard the unmistakable sound of wheezing in his lungs, a sound she, as a professional, could not mistake. At that moment, Amy mentally thanked herself for having the foresight to stop by the pharmacy and purchase everything she might need. She understood that she was working almost blindly, but now her suspicions were confirmed. The man had a severe cold, likely complicated by bronchitis or possibly even pneumonia. "If only I could take him to the hospital for an X-ray," she murmured wistfully, realizing that this was not an option. For one, the clinic was already closed, and for another, this man was practically unfit for transport. "I understand, Amy. But please, do something. I've tried giving him some medicine and tea with raspberries, but it's all been useless," Frank pleaded. "And I brought some honey," Mark added. But Amy just shook her head. "Well, I'm sorry to say, but in cases as advanced as this, home remedies won't do much. I'll leave the medications here, and you'll need to administer them strictly by the clock. Can you manage that?" Frank perked up visibly. "Of course, I can. It's not like I'm busy here on this dump. I'm just living here out of despair." And if needed, I'll help keep an eye on him, Mark chimed in, making the adults laugh. The boy's words were so touching that they brought a gentle smile to Amy's lips. Deep down, she knew that the man's condition was very serious. And they didn't even know his name, as Frank had mentioned that the man had been unconscious the whole time, only occasionally muttering incoherently. Just then, the stranger momentarily regained consciousness and clearly spoke a few words: Helena, interview, deception. Amy started and looked at the sick man in surprise, but he had already fallen back into unconsciousness and couldn't say anything more. His chest heaved with a wheezing sound, a sign that he was still clinging to life. To Frank and Mark, the words spoken by the unfortunate man meant nothing. After all, who knows what a delirious person might babble about in a fever? But to Amy, the man's words made an indelible impression. She stepped away from the door and leaned against the wall to calm herself and collect her thoughts. The thing was, Helena wasn't just a word to her, it was the name of the company where her husband worked. "Amy, are you okay?" Frank cautiously inquired, noticing for the first time that the doctor was as pale as chalk and staring into space. She shook her head and looked at the owner of the shack. "Yes, I'm fine. It was nothing, just a bit of exhaustion from the day. I'm sorry, dear, for pulling you away from your work like this. But when I thought that this poor fellow might die on me, my heart just ached. I almost thought I was about to give up the ghost myself. But I can't do that. I've still got grandkids left after my son Tony." Amy nodded understandingly, then opened the door and stepped outside. The rain still hadn't come, but the strong wind raged, venting its fury on the city's residents with powerful gusts. The words of the vagrant still echoed in her mind. Why had he said that particular phrase? And what connection could this sick man possibly have to her husband's company? The question gnawed at her, leaving her restless. Mark stood obediently a little to the side, patiently waiting for the doctor lady to pull herself together so they could go home. He needed to return too. The caretakers at the orphanage would raise an alarm and start searching for him everywhere. And when they found him, they'd likely forbid him from going outside for a month, which for Mark would be a real tragedy. Few people knew that once a week, the boy visited the cemetery with a bouquet of flowers picked from a city flower bed. He didn't go there by chance. He visited his parents' grave, the ones who had died on that fateful June morning. Sometimes he would sit on the bench in front of the grave and start recounting everything that had happened to him over the past week. Life in the orphanage was never easy, and not a day went by without Mark getting into some kind of conflict with the older kids. It was just the way of things. The strong always bullied the weak, taking whatever they valued most. The caretakers were very fond of Mark, but the older boys were envious and would take any opportunity to give him a light slap on the back of the head. Of course, they did this secretly, when the caretakers weren't looking or had left the room. Mark could have gone and complained to the director or the senior caretaker, but then all the boys would have labeled him a snitch, the kind who runs to tattle at the first opportunity. "Shall we go, Mark?" Amy sighed sadly. Then, turning back to Frank, who was standing a bit away, she added, "Just make sure to give the medicine on time, okay? Don't skip a single dose." He smiled. "All right, I'll take care of everything. Don't you worry. I'm not clueless, you know? He's got a bad cold, and he still hasn't come to his senses." "He's been delirious for 2 days now," Frank assured. Amy nodded in agreement, then took Mark by the hand and headed toward the exit. The time spent at the dump left a lingering sense of unease, though she didn't blame Frank for asking for her help. Rather, Amy was upset with herself for ending up in such an unpleasant place out of her own initiative. Her shoes were probably filthy now, and she dreaded the thought of explaining to her husband the persistent odor clinging to her clothes. The phrase muttered by the vagrant in his delirium kept spinning in her mind, preventing her from focusing on anything else. Finding the way back wasn't difficult, even without relying on her little guide, who navigated the piles of garbage with ease. By the time they finally emerged from the dump, dusk had gently settled over the city. Amy discreetly glanced at her smartphone screen, but there were no incoming calls or notifications from Jerry. She pursed her lips in annoyance. So, her husband hadn't even noticed her absence? Not even a text message or a quick exchange of words? Deep inside, a sense of resentment began to grow, fueled by a spark of suspicion. Lately, her husband seemed like a different person, cold and distant. He often locked himself in his study, sitting at his desk for long hours. At first, Amy attributed it to work problems, which her husband always had plenty of. But then she heard from Jerry's colleagues that the company was doing exceptionally well. There was nothing to complain about. So, how could she explain his late returns home when the clock was nearing midnight? Following the advice of her friend Rhonda Bradley, she had checked the collars of her husband's shirts several times, hoping to find traces of lipstick or catch the scent of women's perfume. But there was nothing. So, what was the reason for his unpleasant coldness? Could it be that he had indeed found someone on the side and was carefully hiding it, enjoying the thrills of a fleeting affair? Realizing that it was too late to wait for a bus, Amy decided to call a taxi. It would be much more convenient. Mark would get back to the orphanage on time, and Amy, exhausted from the day, could rest a little, sitting in the back seat and gazing out the window. The rain never came that day, though the air was thick with moisture. Thunder and lightning raged in the sky, but the rain clouds bypassed the city. In a way, Amy felt relieved, knowing that just a few days ago, the meteorologists had issued a storm warning for their region. After such events, work was always chaotic for her, as people tended to get sick more often than on a nice summer day. The taxi driver turned out to be a friendly guy who didn't ask unnecessary questions. He winked at Mark as he kindly opened the front door and helped him climb in. Amy paid the driver up front and silently stared out the window. Mark sensed that something was troubling his friend, but given his young age, he couldn't figure out what it was. Amy's mind was still fixated on one phrase, the name of her husband's company. And why was that unfamiliar vagrant soaked from head to toe, especially since it hadn't rained that day, and Amy knew that for sure. The only way to get that wet would be to fall into the river that runs through the city and disappears somewhere into the vastness of the country. First, Amy dropped Mark off at the orphanage. She kissed the boy on the cheek as they said goodbye, then walked him to the gate, where the head caregiver noticed her. "Hold on a minute, what do you think you're doing?" "So, it's you Mark has been running off to all this time," the woman began, without any introduction. Amy paled and involuntarily took 2 steps back. "I don't understand, what are you implying?" "Yes, I know Mark, but that doesn't mean he's been running off to see me." The caregiver grimaced. "You know what? You can tell those stories to whoever you like, but not to me. I know I'm responsible for Mark, and if anything happens, the entire staff here will be held accountable. In the worst case, we could even be taken to court. Lorraine, why are you being like this?" Mark tried to soften the caregiver's attitude, but his pleading had no effect on her. Lorraine glared at Amy with clear disdain, as if she were the cause of all their problems. Amy's mood soured completely. This wasn't the kind of reception she had expected at the orphanage. After all, it wasn't her fault that Mark had come to her for help. Besides, if everyone here was so smart and capable, then why were the children sneaking out in broad daylight and wandering around the city, risking getting into trouble? But Amy kept these thoughts to herself, not wanting Mark to get into trouble because of her. Better for the caregiver to blame her for his escapes than to punish the little boy, who was already suffering after losing his parents. "I'm sorry, Lorraine. Don't worry about Mark. He'll really do better," Amy tried to smooth over the awkward moment. The caregiver smirked, but just then, the sound of the taxi horn behind them reminded them that Amy needed to go. She waved goodbye to Mark and hurried back to the car. Throughout the drive, Amy didn't say a word. The driver occasionally glanced at her in the rearview mirror, puzzled about what she might do for a living. Who could this sad woman be, with tears frozen in her eyes? She probably didn't work in an office or do heavy physical labor. Her hands were well-groomed, her face delicate. But that sadness in her eyes spoke volumes. Trying to distract his passenger from her gloomy thoughts, the driver tuned into a local radio station to listen to some music. At first, Amy found it irritating. She just wanted to sit in silence. She was about to say something when she heard something strange. The radio host was reading an announcement from a man named Michael Hale, whom everyone in the city knew. He was a wealthy man and a philanthropist who spent vast sums of money on charity, trying to help everyone in need. Amy first heard about him when he donated new equipment to their clinic. At first, she thought it was just self-promotion, an attempt to boost his personal reputation. But when Michael refused any publicity or media coverage of the event, Amy began to respect him. After all, not every wealthy person would do something like that. No matter how you look at it, most people prioritize their own interests and enjoy the comfort that money brings. Hearing the familiar name, Amy started to pay closer attention. The announcer was saying something like this: "Last night, an unknown man saved Michael's daughter when she and her friends went to the river." While taking selfies on the bridge, the teenagers were laughing and competing to see who could take the best picture. At some point, Michael's daughter, Tracy, leaned over the railing and fell into the water. It all happened so quickly that no one had time to react. Some people shouted that they needed to call an ambulance, while others waved their hands hopelessly, thinking the river's strong currents had already claimed her. But one unremarkable-looking man decided to act bravely and dove into the water. He was out of sight for a while, and some bystanders even began to say he had drowned along with the girl. The most frustrating part was that people were just standing on the shore, commenting breathlessly on what was happening, as if they were watching a movie that would surely have a happy ending, and the director would announce the successful conclusion of filming. But this was real life, harsh and unforgiving, with its relentless attention to detail. Soon, the man's wet head appeared above the water, followed by the girl, who was clinging to his shoulder, desperately trying to stay afloat. The stranger was powerfully swimming toward the shore, using his legs and entire body to help him along. Despite the weight of his wet clothes pulling him down, he confidently stayed afloat, making sure the girl didn't drown. Despite all his efforts, by the time he reached the shore, Tracy was unconscious. There was no time to waste, so the stranger immediately tried to clear her lungs of water by laying her on her side. The unwilling spectators of this drama covered their eyes in horror, thinking Tracy had died. But the brave man knew what he was doing. Soon, the girl was racked with a fit of horse coughing, finally clearing the water from her lungs. At that moment, an ambulance arrived at the scene and dispersed the idle onlookers and witnesses of the tragedy. In the ensuing chaos, the man who saved Tracy blended into the crowd, wishing to remain anonymous. Now, Michael was searching for him to thank him and show the city their hero. Given Michael's resources, one could only imagine the size of the reward being offered. Man, that guy got lucky. If only I'd been in his place, I'd be cruising around in a brand new car by now, the taxi driver said enviously. Amy grimaced, picturing this pudgy driver daring to jump into the raging water. Not only jumping in, but also saving the drowning daughter of a millionaire who, in case of failure, would undoubtedly blame the person who couldn't save his child. At that moment, a thought struck Amy. What if the stranger who saved Tracy Hale was the same unknown vagabond lying in Frank's shack? Of course, these were just suspicions, and they might have nothing to do with reality. Most likely, it was just a coincidence, although a very strange one. After all, Frank had mentioned that he found the stranger in soaking wet clothes while he was delirious with fever, trying to find shelter. The only thing Amy couldn't understand was why the vagabond had hurried to disappear, not even giving his name. If Michael had found out about him, he would have surely rewarded him generously, perhaps even changed his life for the better. At that moment, the taxi pulled up to her house, and the driver announced that they had arrived. Thanking him for the ride, Amy gave him a small tip, even though she was short on money herself. Truthfully, she didn't really know why she did it. Maybe she simply respected the driver for being a true professional. As if on cue, the key to the front door got stuck in the lock, as though it didn't want to let her into the house, which now seemed cold and unwelcoming in the evening twilight. There were no lights on, which meant that Jerry hadn't come back from work yet, assuming he had even gone to work at all. Amy gripped the key tighter, pressed down on the handle, and the door slowly opened, revealing the chaos inside. Dishes piled up on the table, clothes scattered across the floor, and signs of a hasty departure in every neglected corner. The scene was anything but pleasant. Her heart tightened with anxiety, and a sense of impending doom crept into her soul like an uninvited guest. Her eyes fell on a note lying on the kitchen table next to an unfinished cup of coffee. "Amy, I'm sorry, I can't live like this anymore. I've gotten myself into a situation you wouldn't understand. I need to get away. If I find myself, I'll come back. Wait for me. Yours, Jerry." The word struck her like a bolt of lightning. Amy read the note again, searching for any hint, any glimmer of hope. But the words remained just as strange and frightening. In a situation? Left somewhere? How am I supposed to find him now? Thoughts swirled in her mind like a whirlwind, preventing her from thinking clearly. Well, Amy sighed. That's what it means to have a businessman husband. Create a mess, and then just say, "Sorry, I'm leaving to find myself." The phone rang, interrupting her somber thoughts. The number on the screen belonged to her mother-in-law, Janet. "Amy, are you home?" Her voice trembled with worry. "Yes," Amy replied, trying to keep her own anxiety in check. "What's wrong?" "I can't reach Jerry." "Where is he?" "Janet, I don't know either." "He left a note and took off," Amy said. "He says he's gotten himself into some kind of trouble." "Trouble, huh?" her mother-in-law said sorrowfully. "As always. And it's your fault again?" "My fault?" Amy exclaimed. "What do you mean?" "What do I mean?" Janet's voice sharpened with displeasure. "You can't give him what he needs. Children, peace, a cozy home. You're a bad wife, a bad homemaker." Amy flinched. She had always known that her mother-in-law didn't like her. Janet had never thought she was good enough for her only son. But to blame her entirely for Jerry's departure? How can you say that? I've been at work all day. And Jerry was supposed to come over to help you with the repairs, wasn't he? Amy said, bewildered. And what am I supposed to say? Janet snapped. Repairs? Jerry is just running away from you. But Amy tried to recall her mother-in-law's previous words. You yourself said he should live for himself, build his career. Yes. Janet interrupted. But he should live for himself and take care of his mother, and you're just distracting him. Amy could no longer listen. Her hands were trembling, and her mind was spinning with anxious thoughts. Janet, I don't want to argue with you. I don't know what happened with Jerry, and I don't know where he is now. But please, don't make me the scapegoat. Oh, look at you speaking up. Janet's voice was cold with a sneer. And who am I in this story? Do you think I want to live alone? I want to see my son. And what's stopping you? Amy asked. He's always been around. You never turned down his company. Always around, yes, Janet retorted. With a wife who can't even cook a proper dinner. Janet. Amy's patience snapped. You're going too far. I don't know what's happening, but I don't want to hear your accusations. At that moment, Amy realized that arguing was pointless. Janet lived in her own world, full of traditional values and unshakable principles. And in that world, there was no room for freedom of choice, independence, or self-fulfillment. Janet, Amy said, her voice tired. I don't know what will happen next. I don't know where Jerry is or how to find him, but I ask you, give me time to figure this out. Time? Janet's cold smile was dismissive. You don't have as much time as you think. And what do you suggest? Amy asked. How much longer must I endure your reproaches? What are you talking about, dear? Janet said with disdain. You shouldn't endure, you should act, to bring Jerry back home as soon as possible. How? Amy asked. How can I bring him back if I don't even know where he is? Then find him. Janet snapped. Think of all his friends, acquaintances, business partners. Call them, send texts, but find him. Otherwise, you can't do anything in this life. You're a complete failure." Amy didn't respond. She ended the call. She turned away and went to her room. She felt so hurt and upset. She had invested all her energy and feelings into this marriage, but her mother-in-law refused to see her happiness. Janet only wanted to see her son, to feel her control over him. "How could I have not given you happiness?" Amy whispered. "Didn't I love you? Didn't I give everything I had?" She approached the window and looked out at the dark street. The wind howled outside, as if echoing the storm within her. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked quietly. "How do I find Jerry?" At that moment, her gaze fell on a small note lying on the table. She read it again, but the situation remained unclear. The words felt like a sentence, and she felt panic beginning to rise in her soul. She tried calling, but the phone was silent. She didn't know what to do, where to go, or who to ask for help. "Well, what have I done to you?" Amy whispered to herself. "Why did you run away?" Struggling to pull herself together, she decided that morning would bring more clarity. What good would come from tormenting herself with thoughts of the mysterious disappearance? After a hasty shower, Amy only dreamed of one thing: sleep. To dissolve into the fluffy serenity of sleep, where there would be no anxious calls, no urgent rounds, and no endless struggle for the lives of sick patients. But thoughts, like uninvited guests, stubbornly refused to leave her alone. She ran her hand across the cool surface of the pillow, tried to close her eyes, but sleep stubbornly eluded her. Suddenly, memories of the day she first saw her future husband came flooding back uncontrollably. Amy remembered the pouring rain that had lasted for hours, turning the city into an endless mirror of water reflecting the pale lights of the street lamps. It happened on a train as she was heading to a conference in the capital. There were still a few hours before reaching the metropolis when Amy heard loud laughter nearby. She looked out and saw Jerry sitting on the train's vestibule steps, joking with other passengers. The stranger was in a tracksuit, a bright t-shirt, and had a cheerful look in his eyes. He was telling a story about losing his travel bag at the station, and everyone was laughing. Amy stood and watched the guy, amazed by his boundless energy. She couldn't imagine how someone could be so cheerful on such a tiresome journey. But the stranger was smiling, and that's what attracted her. She was about to return to her compartment when she heard behind her. "Hi. You look like I've surprised you with something." She turned around and saw the stranger in the tracksuit standing right behind her, smiling with his dazzling smile. "Yes, a little," Amy said, smiling. "I couldn't believe you could be so cheerful on this trip." "What's so surprising?" Jerry asked, looking puzzled. "Do you think you can't be comfortable on a train?" "Well, I didn't think so," Amy replied. "But I usually sleep through the trip." "So, where are you headed?" Jerry asked. "To a conference," she replied. "I'm a doctor, Amy." "Wow. How interesting." "I'm also going to the capital." "I'm a businessman, Jerry Todd." "A businessman?" Amy was taken aback. She was certain that Jerry was still in school, given how young he seemed. "Well, yes." "What's surprising about that?" "I sell jewelry and gemstones." "Jewelry?" Amy could hardly believe her ears. "Do you have your own store?" "No," Jerry answered. "I sell it online. I have my own website. Would you like to see it?" "Sure," Amy replied. "I'm interested." They spent the rest of the journey together. Jerry talked about his business, his dreams, and Amy listened, watching him with fascination. She liked his energy and cheerfulness. She no longer thought about him selling jewelry online. To her, Jerry could be anyone: a pilot, a builder, an actor. She saw a world of possibilities in him. And she felt an inexhaustible potential in her new acquaintance. When it was time to part at the station, Amy didn't know that it would be only a short time before they would become husband and wife. In the morning, Amy woke up to the sound of her phone ringing on the nightstand. Usually, she woke up by sleepily reaching out to turn off the alarm. But today, the alarm had been off since the night before, when she had been too exhausted to even set it. She turned onto her side, looking at the empty half of the bed, and heard the phone ringing again, persistent, anxious. It rang for the fourth time, and Amy realized it was work calling. She sighed heavily and answered the phone. "Hey, Amy, are you coming in for your shift today?" asked the department head, Stephen Reeves. "I'm sorry, but I can't. I have unforeseen circumstances." "What happened, Amy? Is everything all right?" "Yes, everything's fine. I'm just not feeling well. I won't be able to work today." "I see. How long do you think it will take to recover?" asked Stephen. "I'm not sure yet. I'll call you as soon as I know." "All right, Amy. Just don't forget, we're waiting for you." "Yes, Stephen. I won't forget." "Thank you, and sorry," Amy replied and hung up the phone. Then she looked sadly at the empty half of the bed. Her mind felt blank as she sat there, staring. She couldn't believe this had happened. Her beloved husband had left, just like that, without leaving any explanation or a chance to reconsider. She remembered the wedding. It had been a beautiful day, full of sunshine, love, and hope. She had been the happiest woman in the world. Jerry had seemed so young, handsome, and kind. That day, she was certain they would be together forever. And the first years of their marriage? They had been filled with love, joy, and hope. They had traveled a lot and made plans for the future. And they had a beautiful home. But recently, something had changed. Jerry had become more closed off, distant, working long hours, coming home late, and then withdrawing into himself as if he didn't notice her. Amy tried to talk to him, but he would always make jokes, saying he was just very tired from work. She tried to be understanding, not to press him, and worked hard to create a comfortable atmosphere at home so that her husband wouldn't feel irritated. She even renovated their bedroom, bought a new sofa, and changed the curtains. But nothing seemed to help. Jerry continued to drift further away. "I must not have known him well enough," Amy said out loud again, trying to convince herself of this. Finally, she got out of bed and went to the bathroom to wash her face with cold water, hoping to clear her head. She looked in the mirror. The reflection showed a young, beautiful woman, but her eyes revealed pain and emptiness. And now what? She asked herself aloud. There was no answer to that question. Then there was a quiet knock at the door. Amy jolted and went to open it, thinking her husband had returned. "Mark?" she asked, barely recognizing the boy standing on the doorstep. "Hello, Amy," he replied, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. "I'm sorry for coming so early. I found your address at the hospital." "What happened?" Amy asked, feeling a premonition of something bad tightening in her chest. "That man from yesterday, he woke up." "But how?" Amy asked, still not fully understanding. "Frank said he woke up this morning," Mark said, as always, with a serious, grown-up demeanor. "Well, let's go, I'll see," Amy replied, feeling a strong wave of compassion return to her. As a doctor, she couldn't leave a sick person unattended. They went outside. The morning was quite cool. Apparently, there had been rain somewhere nearby yesterday, though it had missed their town. Mark walked beside her, silently watching his feet. Amy noticed he was wearing an old windbreaker that seemed too big for him, with patches on the sleeves and worn-out pants. "Mark, how are you?" she asked, breaking the prolonged silence. "Are you going to school today?" "Of course." Mark smiled, and his face lit up with childlike joy. "But not for studying, it's summer. We have a poetry reading contest today." "Wow," Amy said in surprise. "And what will you be reading?" "A poem by Dickens," Mark replied, already caught up in his upcoming role. A few minutes later, they arrived at the hovel. Even though she had been there yesterday, she still couldn't reconcile the thought that such a place, where people lived in poverty and despair, existed just a few meters away from her. "Frank, are you home?" she asked as she entered the old artist's hovel. "Yes, I'm here," Frank replied, coming out of a room with a spoon in his hand. "How is our patient?" Amy asked, glancing at the homeless man who was sitting on a chair. "As you can see, he's alive," Frank said, pointing with the spoon. "He woke up this morning as if nothing had happened." Amy stepped forward and examined the vagrant. He was tall and thin, with a look of anxiety in his eyes. He wore a dirty jacket, worn-out pants, and scuffed shoes. "Hello," Amy whispered, unsure of what else to say. "Good day," the vagrant replied, looking at her with large, sad eyes. "Thank you for saving me. I feel noticeably better today." "You're welcome," Amy replied, awkwardly lowering her gaze. "I was just doing my job." "What's your name?" the stranger asked, cautiously getting up from the chair. "Amy," she answered, somewhat embarrassed by the question. "And yours?" "I'm Timothy," the vagrant said. "Nice to meet you, Timothy," Amy smiled, feeling her usual sense of calm return. "What happened to you?" "Timothy, tell Amy what happened to you recently," Frank suggested, nodding at the vagrant, who was slouched on the chair. Timothy, clenching and unclenching his fingers as if sorting through invisible beads, began his story with difficulty. "You know, I thought life had completely abandoned me. There hadn't been any work for a long time. And my strength for carrying boxes or cleaning trash was running out. Plus, not everywhere takes you." Amy nodded, understanding. "Well, a couple of days ago," Timothy continued, "I saw an ad. The company Alada needed movers. I thought maybe it would work out." Timothy stood up and took a few steps around the room, as if recalling the events in his memory. "So I went there, filled out the application, and then I was called in by the head of the department, I suppose, Jerry Todd, that's what he was called. In a suit, tie, and a ring on his finger. And his face, was so arrogant and haughty. A beauty kept circling around him the whole time." At this point, Timothy paused, as if reliving those unpleasant moments. Meanwhile, Amy was on the verge of losing her composure, realizing that this was about her husband, with some beauty. "Oh God, could this really be true?" Timothy continued. "Well, he asked me about my education. I told him I finished school and then a technical college. Just like everyone else. But apparently, that wasn't enough." "Really?" Amy asked, struggling to contain her anger. "Yes," Timothy said, "then they started mocking me. Said they didn't want a mover like me, even for free." "And what happened next?" Amy asked, barely able to hold back tears, as she was really beyond caring about questions at this point. Now she understood where her Jerry had gone and the problems he mentioned in the note. Then I went to the river. Just to calm down. Maybe catch some fish in the quiet bay or crayfish. But as I approached, I saw a girl fall from the bridge. So, I rushed to save her." A tear rolled down Amy's cheek. That was Tracy Hale, the daughter of millionaire Michael Hale. He's looking for his daughter's savior everywhere. Timothy seemed to be in disbelief. But it was just," he stammered. "It was an accident." "An accident?" Amy said with a smile. "Yes, it's fate. You didn't just save a girl, you saved the daughter of a wealthy man." Timothy stared at her silently, as if not knowing what to do next. "You should go to Michael," Amy said. "He needs to know who saved his daughter." Timothy sighed, a shadow of embarrassment crossing his eyes. "I don't know," he mumbled. "I just helped and didn't want anything in return." "Timothy," Amy said, taking his hand. "You deserve a reward. You saved a life at the risk of your own and should receive what's rightfully yours." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "I can't." "You must," Amy said, standing up and stepping toward the door. "I'll explain everything, just trust me." In the next moment, she left the hovel, leaving Timothy in confusion. A few hours later, a convoy arrived at the hovel. "Timothy, please come out," a commanding voice called out. The vagrant stepped outside and saw a tall, stately man in an expensive suit. "Hello," Timothy greeted the guest. "I'm Michael," the businessman introduced himself, extending his hand. "Thank you so much for saving my daughter." "You're welcome," Timothy said, shaking his hand. "I want to reward you," Michael insisted. "And I'm prepared to offer you anything you want." "Thank you, but I don't need anything," Timothy replied. "Don't be modest," the businessman smiled. "I know that's not true. So, I'm ready to offer you new housing and a job." "New housing?" Timothy asked, surprised. "Yes," Michael confirmed. "That's right. And much more." "Thank you, but it feels awkward, who you are and who I am." "But you need a roof over your head, don't you?" the businessman insisted. "So don't refuse, consider this matter settled." "Thank you," Timothy repeated, struggling to hold back tears. "Agreed," Michael said. "Then we'll see each other again. My manager will handle all the arrangements." True to his word, the businessman provided Timothy with a job at his company, where he became the head of warehouse operations. It was a good, steady job that allowed him to feel secure about the future. Having never seen her runaway husband again, Amy finalized her divorce and built a life with Timothy. As it turned out, Jerry had lied in the note and had left not alone but with a mistress who had persuaded him to commit a crime for a substantial sum of money. The house, gifted by millionaire Michael, was very cozy. It had a large kitchen where they spent their evenings talking about everything under the sun, a big living room, a bathroom, and a bedroom that was their sanctuary, a place of love and tenderness. A few months later, Amy and Timothy had a modest wedding. There was no grand celebration, just close friends and family, and of course, Frank and Mark. But it was the happiest wedding. Amy, Timothy took her hand. "We've talked so often about having a child. Do you think we're ready?" Amy smiled, her heart filled with love and happiness. She wanted to give Timothy and herself what they had longed for. "Timothy," she said, "I want to adopt a child from the orphanage." He was taken aback. He had never considered adopting a child. But within moments, he understood exactly what Amy wanted. He supported her decision. "Okay," he said, winking at his wife. "Let's do it. Besides, we already have a little boy in mind." Amy smiled. She was thrilled that Mark would finally have a chance at a normal life. At first, Mark was shy and couldn't believe he was going to have a real family. But Timothy and Amy patiently reassured him that they loved him and would take care of him. "Mark," Amy said, hugging him, "you're part of our family now. You have us, and we will never leave you." He cried. These were tears of joy, love, and gratitude. Mark felt happier than he ever had before. Soon after they became a family, Jerry was finally arrested. Even though he had fled with his mistress and the company's money, justice eventually caught up with him. Amy was relieved that it was all over. She had freed herself from a difficult past and could now live in the present and dream of the future. Amy watched Timothy playing with their son in the garden, and her heart was filled with gratitude for what had happened in her life. She loved her men with all her heart and knew that they would be together forever. "Timothy," she whispered, looking at him, "I'm so glad that I have you." Her husband looked up and smiled. He was happy too. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.